band that like that, and it's happened a lot of times, like the Clash. It happened to the Clash, and it happens to bands every generation.
Yeah, and
it happened to the White Stripes,
And it's really interesting because like you really look at like the musical landscape. We're coming out of the '80s, like the era of the Motley Crues, the Twisted Sisters, Poisons, that throw these big elaborate shows and whatnot. And then out comes Nirvana, where they're just dressed in like a pair of Converse sneakers and jeans and whatnot, and a flannel shirt, and they're just like, fuck it, whatever, we're here to rock. Not even really that. They're just like, okay, we're here because they told us we have to be here and get paid. And just did straight up rock and roll. Like there was no like light show, there was no like pyro going off, there was no nothing. It was just the band. It seemed a lot more like intimate, and people were starting to buy into that.
Well, yeah, music is cycles, and each cycle, it doesn't. We don't know how long a cycle will be, and we don't know when it's going to come. It's not necessarily a consistent thing like a wavelength. But it's always a reaction to the other side of it. And, this hairband hard rock thing had gone on for a long time. And, the longer it goes on, the bands aren't getting any better. Bands were getting worse, if anything, because they were copying what had come before. And I'm not going to comment specifically on the hairband thing. I do that in the book, kind of in a comical way, because it's easy to make comedy with that. And who's to talk? My hair was pretty high too.
Yeah, anybody looks anybody looks like the back of Radio Free Boston. Like there's the picture of Carter with this huge like head of hair. Like the first time I looked at it, I was like, that's got to be a wig. That's
well, it wasn't. It was I have to take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we went for elevation and length in the hair back then. That's the funny aspect of it. They started becoming more of a joke. The music was less important and the image was more important. And you know what? That's okay because it's fun. That's okay. I enjoy going to see those bands. I enjoy going to see, in my Motley Crue chapter, I mentioned that a critic for Billboard magazine said that they can't write good songs, they play lousy, they have an original thought among them. And I write, oh yeah, that was true, but who cares? It was fun. It was a great show. So that's the idea, is as long as you're having a good time and it's a great show, maybe the music's good, maybe the music's okay. It isn't necessarily important to you. But maybe the music is important to you. Well, then maybe that's not your show. But for all intents and purposes, there was a tipping point. And a lot of people were listening to music that were disenfranchised with that hairband music. More and more and more people were disenfranchised. So when an alternative suddenly came, it was a landslide heading towards that alternative. That landslide, it went back towards punk rock and a minimalist style, all about the music, all about rock and roll, all about that, as opposed to the image, almost like a play on stage doing rock and roll. It's not a real thing. It's a caricature in a certain way. And like I'm saying, there's nothing wrong with doing a caricature of rock and roll. But at times there needs to be a readdressing and a balancing, and that's what that happened. It was just one of the most amazing balancings in music history. Bands that were used to playing at the Centrum in Worcester were suddenly having a hard time filling, Club Casino in Hampton Beach. So it was a rude awakening for a lot of people. I can imagine it really led to a lot of people having problems because it's like they just watched their stardom fall away.
Yeah, and I gotta ask about the there was a story that came out years ago, kind of like going back to what we were talking about, parallel universes. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this. There was another singer that almost auditioned for Van Halen after David Lee Roth had quit or got fired, whatever story you choose to believe there. Sammy Hagar gets the gig and whatnot, but there was another guy who was supposed to audition and was Eric Martin from Mr. Big.
Right.
So, I don't know, have you heard much of Mr. Big's music and what you thought, maybe Eric Martin could have had a chance at that, or?
Well, yeah, I remember Mr. Big was, Mr. Big's a good example. I mean, we played them on BCN when I was there. They had more musical chops than most of those bands. They had some pretty decent. Those guys could play, but they were all caught up in that whole thing, that whole scene change, and they sort of just, you didn't hear from them again. He was a good singer, though. I mean, I imagine that only the guys in the band are going to know who's right, because there's more than just music involved. There's more involved than just, can we stand this guy? There's got to be a chemistry or something. A band like Van Halen has to make magic happen. They have to make magic as good as the previous magic, or it's not going to happen. How many times have bands tried to replace an essential member, and usually it's going to be the lead singer because they're the face of the band. How many times has a group tried to replace a lead singer and it has totally not worked, and boom, there they go. I mean, Van Halen would experience that when they put Gary Cherone in the mix, and I love Gary and I loved Extreme, but the chemistry just didn't work. And some people would say, and I think there's credence to the fact that Eddie Van Halen was writing some very unhit music, not unhip, unhit music for that Van Halen 3, and that was really the cause, and maybe not Gary Cherone. But, getting off the subject, I think, when they sat and rehearsed with Sammy Hagar, I think it was apparent to all of them that there was something happening here. I'm sure it involved more than just the audition. I'm sure it involved, after the audition, going and hanging out, having a meal, having some drinks, sitting around shooting the shit, maybe working on a song or two, and then going, this is really working. And then it just clicks into place. And so, I think maybe Eric Martin, it just didn't click into place. But as far as pipes go, I think he could have handled it.
I think he could have handled it too, but the way the story goes, as he told it, was he was going to audition for it, and then he heard Sammy Hagar was in the running for it as well, and he was just like, I just chickened out. He's like, there's no way I can compete with Sammy Hagar. And the good thing is it worked out for everybody involved. Van Halen went on to newfound success there. Eric Martin hooks up with Billy Sheehan and forms Mr. Big and whatnot, and they go on worldwide tours as well. So it worked out for everybody, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I love Van Halen. I liked the early Van Halen. Saw them a few times, and then I saw the Hagar Van Halen a bunch of times, and I saw the Gary Cherone Van Halen. I wanted to write a Van Halen story for the book. I just couldn't, get a story with enough meat on it. It just wasn't enough. I mean, I saw Van Halen when they did a couple of big nights at the Boston Garden in 1981. Those were the shows where, with Women and Children First, where David Lee Roth had started the show by jumping over jumping out of the trampoline and onto the center of the stage. And those are great shows. And then I think my favorite Sammy Hagar shows when they did Monsters of Rock with Metallica and the Scorpions, and they had to do a shorter show because Sammy could go on talking on stage, and sometimes those shows would go 3 hours, but it was a lot of talk, and it could get a little tedious at times. But on the Monsters of Rock tour, they did an hour and a half, and that's all they had. And so it was just bam, 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 and that was the OU812 album. And so Sammy and the band had 2 albums under their belt at that point, and those, I think, were my favorite 2 albums that they did with Sammy. So all the material was really good. So, I just couldn't get a Van Halen story together, so apologies to the Van Halen fans for that.
That's all right. That's why there's a second book,
yeah, there you go. Decibel Diaries 2.
Yeah, if you have the time.
Oh, man.
Decibel Diaries 2. I turned it up to 11 by Carter Allen.
What? That would be a good name for a book. Actually, my original choice for a title was 50 Shades of the Stage, which I presented to the publisher, and they thought was great, but then they got worried that there'd be some sort of litigation from the 50 Shades of Grey guy, the publisher. So they suggested Decibel Diaries. I went, I like that. I love that. So we used that. It came out good.
Yeah, but I mean, if the 50 Shades of Grey, publisher kind of, ties you up in legal loopholes, at least just know that they're easy enough to get out of. The guy doesn't know what the hell he's doing.
Right. Well, if I wait too long to do a sequel, I'll have to name it the Decibel Epitaphs.
Yeah.
the way people are dropping off these days. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh. And what a shock about Chris Cornell. Oh my goodness.
Oh man, like you talk about just an absolutely brilliant, like, tortured mind. It's like I don't know if it was like the combination of like the prescription drug that he was on that just kind of like sent him over the edge, or if there was some other factors that we're not knowing about. But I mean, such a brilliant songwriter, singer. I mean, he's just like he was another voice of I wouldn't say he was like the voice of a generation. He was like one of. Like,
well, he was a major voice. I mean, we were just talking about Nirvana and that huge change. They were one of the point bands. I mean, they were the first band to get a major label deal, Soundgarden. Yeah. And I write about Soundgarden in the book because the Nirvana story was much more poignant than the Pearl Jam story. I thought I do reference Soundgarden. I saw Soundgarden out in Fitchburg. The show was amazing. It was a great show. His voice was incredible. And the thing is, you're focused on these 70-year-old guys that you think are on the endangered list, like the Stones and some of these guys, and you're not really thinking about someone who's 52 who seemed to be okay. I mean, Kurt Cobain was always a loose cannon. It just seemed like he was heading towards disaster, but you never suspected that with Chris Cornell, and it seemed like people that were around him didn't suspect it either. Tom Morello. I mean, it just from what he tweeted out, it didn't seem like he expected that. It just seemed like a shock to everybody. So it's too bad. It really is, and it happens in every generation. And you want to turn around and say, "Look it, guys, this is what can happen. Just wake up." But everybody's got to learn and go their own way and learn those hard lessons and be their own person. So they're only going to listen to you somewhat. I mean, David Bowie's changes. That song says it. Yeah. You can say that you can tell people that they're going towards their destruction, but they're well aware of the changes they're going through.
Yeah. His changes song. It's pretty much the most beautiful way you could ever tell somebody, like, look, you can lead a horse to water, and the jackass isn't gonna fucking drink it.
Yeah.
That's it's the most beautiful way to do it. But
yeah. But once again, I mean, I think my book celebrates life. I think rock and roll, if you consider rock and roll as an entity, even as a person, it's alive and well all these years later. It goes through what people go through, goes forward, goes backwards, makes mistakes, makes great moves, ages but stays young because of the music. It's at this point in time, all these years later, it's still healthy. And even though pop music may have the high ground right now, it doesn't mean that rock and roll isn't great. There's plenty of great rock and roll out there if you're willing to look for it. And I think that's going to always continue.
Yeah, I do have to get your opinion on this though, because this is one of the questions I was thinking about before I got you on here. Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons from Kiss, saying that one day Kiss is going to have just 4 brand new members. Like Gene and Paul aren't going to be in the band. Eric has pretty much said look, if Gene and Paul aren't in the band, I'm not going to be in it. I'm not going to do that. Blah blah blah. I just wanted to kind of gauge your reaction on that. You think something like a replacement Kiss would be really that successful without Gene and Paul?
Well, I'm sorry to say it probably could, but I think maybe it's unique to Kiss. In other words, like if Leonard Skinner, if Gary Washington goes, can Leonard Skinner really continue? There'll be nobody in the band that's original. I mean, the closest lineage they would have is that Johnny Van Zant, the brother of the original singer, is the singer. So is that valid? I don't think so, and I don't know if the fans would go for it. But Kiss